When a newly widowed woman stands outside a weathered farmhouse she has just inherited, she first thinks about leaky roofs, paint-chipped banisters, and dusty furniture. She expects a quiet weekend of sorting old boxes, discarding moldy papers, and maybe planting a few hydrangeas along the front porch. But as she steps onto those ancient floorboards and senses a draft from below, one chilling detail changes everything, sending her on a journey that threatens to unravel not only her late husband's memory but her very sense of reality. Before we dive into this haunting story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you believe that courage can guide us through the shadows of the past, give this video a like and subscribe for more stories that unveil hidden truths. She found an old door in the basement, nailed shut, sealed away for decades. At first, it looked like just another repair job. But the moment she pried it open, she discovered relics of a life she never knew her husband had. There were letters in a language she didn't recognize and cryptic notes about a Cold War scheme. Each item told a fragment of a story that would upend everything she believed about the man she loved. Now, let's step into the past to see how Evelyn uncovered Harold's most deeply hidden truth, and what it cost her to finally bring his real identity into the light. She had expected sorrow but never suspicion. When Harold died, Evelyn grieved in the usual ways. She cried in the shower, stared at his empty chair in the living room, and avoided the lingering smell of his aftershave in the bathroom cabinet. They had been married for 41 years, a modest life in a modest suburb. Harold was quiet, a telecommunications specialist who never seemed to bring work home with him. He read the paper each morning, drank his coffee black, sometimes murmuring offhand remarks about his brief service in the Navy or the fact he had grown up in New Jersey. He never talked much about his parents, except to say they died when he was in his late teens. Evelyn had accepted his reticence as part of his nature. She was more talkative, more sociable, and Harold's calm, self-contained presence had always felt like a steadying force. In the weeks following Harold's funeral, Evelyn received a call from his older sister, Janice. Their relationship had been amicable but distant. Janice lived upstate, and visits were rare. Janice offered Evelyn something unexpected: the family's old farmhouse in a remote corner of New York. It had fallen into disrepair, and Janice wanted no part of it. She insisted that Harold would have wanted Evelyn to decide its fate. First, Evelyn balked. She knew nothing about farmhouses or rural living, but Janice's gentle urging and the sudden wave of curiosity, why had Harold never mentioned this property, convinced her to accept. She packed a small bag, planning just a short trip to inspect the place. She had no illusions of turning it into a permanent home. She expected a rundown structure, squirrels in the attic, maybe some water damage. It was a 3-hour drive from her suburban house. She left early one morning, the sunrise casting pink streaks across the horizon, her mind drifting between memories of Harold and the sense that something was amiss. There was no logic to this feeling, just an uncomfortable awareness that Harold had never once, in 4 decades, spoken of a family farmhouse. The drive took her through winding roads, past farmland and sleepy towns with old diners and antique stores. She stopped once to stretch her legs, sipping coffee at a gas station where the cashier, an elderly man, asked if she was local. She shook her head and explained she was heading to the old Morrison place. Harold's family name was Morrison, and the man nodded thoughtfully. "Been empty a while," he said. "Good luck with that." She thanked him, feeling an odd flutter of nerves. She arrived mid-afternoon. From the outside, the house looked surprisingly sturdy, perched on a gentle slope with tall grass swaying in the yard. The paint had peeled away in places, and the porch steps creaked ominously when she tested them. The front door was locked, but Janice had mailed her the key. Evelyn slid it into the rusty lock, turning it with effort, and stepped into a musty foyer. Dust blanketed the floor, and the air felt stale. She coughed, flicking on a light switch that mercifully worked, casting a weak glow down a narrow hallway. For a moment, a flicker of unease crept up her spine. Harold had never even hinted he still owned this place with Janice. Why? Determined not to let her imagination run wild, Evelyn began a systematic walkthrough. The kitchen was cramped, with a worn linoleum floor and outdated appliances. A living room off to the right held old furniture draped in sheets. Through a hallway, she found 2 small bedrooms with bare mattresses, a bathroom with chipped tiles. The place was old but not horrifying. She opened windows to let in fresh air, dust swirling in the shafts of sunlight. After bringing in a few supplies from the car, she decided to head to the basement. She found a door under the stairwell leading down. The steps groaned under her weight, and the air grew damp and cold the deeper she descended. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling. She pulled its chain, illuminating a space crowded with old boxes, tools, and what looked like a broken water heater in the corner. She sighed. This would be a project, but one she could handle. As she explored, something caught her eye. A single shelf, full of battered books, pressed against the cinder block wall. Near the bottom, the shelf extended over a small door, so inconspicuous she almost missed it. The door was roughly child-sized, made of old wood, with nails hammered across it in a crude attempt to seal it shut. Evelyn crouched and peered at it. Why would someone nail shut a tiny door in the basement? She felt a prickle of apprehension. Maybe it was just for storage. Still, the hammered nails struck her as odd, like someone wanted to hide something or keep something in. She hesitated, then fetched a small crowbar from a nearby pile of tools. She gently pried at the nails, wincing at the screech of metal. One by one, the nails popped out. The door was stiff, but after some effort, it opened a crack. A stale draft escaped, carrying a faint smell of damp paper. She stood back, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness inside. The space beyond was bigger than she expected, maybe the size of a walk-in closet. She reached for her phone flashlight, clicked it on, and stepped inside carefully. The first thing she saw was a desk, a small wooden desk with a child's chair. Next to it, a built-in shelf with old radio equipment, Cold War era, she later learned. There were maps on the walls, pinned haphazardly. One map was of Berlin, another of Dresden, both riddled with markings and scribbled notes in a language she didn't recognize. It looked like Cyrillic or maybe German script. She felt her heart thud. Harold had never hinted at anything related to espionage or foreign languages. Yet here, in his family's basement, was an entire hidden room seemingly devoted to what? Intelligence gathering? She moved the flashlight beam to the desk. On top lay dusty notebooks, each labeled with what appeared to be German grammar instructions. She recognized words like der, die, das from high school language classes. Her confusion mounted. She stepped closer, noticing an old reel-to-reel tape recorder, the brand name in German. The hair on her arms prickled as she realized it was a piece of East German technology, something you might see in a spy movie. She picked up a faded photograph of a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8, with solemn eyes and a hint of a smile. The name Eric was written across the top in neat handwriting. She didn't recognize the child. Heart pounding, she opened a drawer in the desk. It stuck, but she managed to yank it free, revealing a stack of letters hidden behind it. She lifted them out carefully, noticing the foreign script. Pages and pages of what looked like a child's handwriting, mixed with typed documents. She flipped through them, her eyes landing on the occasional English word, but mostly seeing German phrases. The sense of creeping alarm intensified. Who was Eric, and why was he connected to this bizarre setup in the farmhouse? She stayed for hours in that hidden room, carefully laying out the papers on the desk, scanning them for any clues. One typed page had a heading that read Kinderkontakt, followed by a phrase in German. Another had the word Stasi, a term she vaguely recognized as referring to East Germany's secret police. She felt a wave of nausea. This was insane. The Stasi? The Cold War? She tried to imagine Harold's father or mother being involved in something so cloak and dagger. Could it be extended family? Where did Harold fit in? As dusk approached, she realized she needed help. She snapped photos of the documents with her phone, feeling a tremor in her hand as she did. She was no historian, and none of this made sense. She left the room, closed the door gently, though she did not nail it shut. In a state of half-shock, she retreated upstairs, rummaged for a blanket, and curled up on a dusty couch, trying to process the day's discovery. Sleep did not come easily. She found her thoughts circling back to Harold. He had always been distant, reluctant to talk about his childhood. She recalled once pressing him for stories about his life before they met, and he'd shrugged, saying he didn't remember much. She'd taken it at face value. Now, she wondered if his not remembering was actually true or a carefully constructed shield. Had he known about the farmhouse's secrets? The possibility that Harold had carried a hidden burden for decades kept her awake. She dozed off near dawn, haunted by the image of the boy named Eric, the letters in German, and the looming presence of the Cold War equipment. The next day, she called a friend back home, a retired librarian, to ask if he knew any academic experts who might help decipher the German documents. He recommended a Cold War historian at Columbia University, a man named Professor Mark Engel. Nervous but determined, Evelyn gathered the letters and her phone photos, drove into the nearest town for better cell reception, and placed a call to the professor's office. After some initial back and forth with his assistant, she managed to explain enough to spark his interest, and he agreed to look at her materials. They arranged for Evelyn to drive to the city the following day. She left the farmhouse in a swirl of unanswered questions, telling herself she would be back. For now, she needed clarity. The drive to New York City felt surreal. She replayed every conversation she'd had with Harold about his youth, searching for any clue, but only found silence. Once in the city, she met Professor Engel in a cluttered office stacked with books about espionage, Eastern Europe, and the Cold War. He was a man in his mid-50s, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His handshake was warm, though his expression carried academic curiosity rather than personal empathy. She spread the letters on a small table. Engel skimmed them, occasionally muttering translations under his breath. The words he spoke in English triggered chills in Evelyn. References to an infiltration program, to children reassigned identities, to suppressed memories. Engel's brow furrowed deeper with each page. At one point, he exhaled sharply. Kinderkontakt, he said. It was rumored to be one of the Stasi's more secretive operations. The idea was to groom children for espionage, to place them in Western countries without suspicion. These children were sometimes orphans, or they were forcibly taken from parents deemed unreliable. They were given new backgrounds, new families. Some ended up in the United States. Evelyn felt her stomach twist. But that's insane. Are you saying these children were reprogrammed? Engel nodded gravely. Yes, reprogrammed, you could say. The Stasi was extremely thorough. They would erase the child's original identity, often using psychological conditioning, even mild forms of trauma, so the child wouldn't remember their past. Over time, they would place them in families that either cooperated with the regime or were unwitting participants. The goal was to create sleepers, agents who might be activated later, or at least glean intelligence. It's a dark corner of Cold War history. Officially, it's never been fully acknowledged. If these letters are genuine, you've stumbled on a piece of it. Evelyn's mind spun. She felt lightheaded. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. I found a child's photograph labeled Eric. Could Harold, my husband, have been that boy? Saying it aloud made the world tilt. He said he was from New Jersey. He had a normal childhood, or so he claimed. Engel read more, flipping pages with growing urgency. There are references to an American relocation in 1971. Mentions of the child's confusion, nightmares in German, repeated visits with a handler figure. This strongly suggests the boy was indeed relocated to the United States. If your husband was born around the late 1950s or early 1960s, this timeline could fit. Tears pricked Evelyn's eyes. He was born in 1959, or so we always thought. His official documents said 1959. Anyway, that aligns suspiciously well, Engel said, voice subdued. Evelyn, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but all signs suggest your husband might have been part of this Kinderkontakt program. The question is, did he know? Did he remain an asset? Or was he simply one of the lost children, living out his life in America with no recollection? Evelyn couldn't speak for a moment. She sat there, stunned, heart aching for Harold. This man she loved and believed she knew intimately. She pictured him, quiet at the breakfast table, reading the newspaper headlines about international conflicts. Had any of those stories jarred his suppressed memories? She wondered if the restlessness in his eyes was from some old wound he couldn't articulate. Professor Engel cleared his throat. I can translate the documents more thoroughly for you, but I suspect you already sense the truth. If you want to investigate further, you may face bureaucratic hurdles. The Stasi archives in Germany are partial, and the U.S. intelligence community might not be forthcoming. Are you sure you want to pursue this? Evelyn swallowed hard. She thought of Harold's final days in the hospital, how he'd squeezed her hand, looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. She nodded. He's gone now, and I want to understand. Not to blame him, but to grant him peace. And maybe to find closure for myself. His sister, Janice, might have some answers too. Engel agreed to do more research, and Evelyn left his office in a daze. She found a motel for the night, too exhausted to drive back. Her dreams were filled with strange images. A small boy trembling in the dark, a stern figure whispering in his ear in German, a plane crossing the Atlantic. She woke in a cold sweat, tears on her cheeks. She couldn't shake the sadness of it. If Harold really had been torn from his original life, did he ever fully belong anywhere? Early the next morning, she drove back to the farmhouse, determined to search deeper. She spent the day cataloging everything in the hidden room, photographing documents, scanning for anything she missed. She discovered notes scribbled in the margins, references to an address in New Jersey that matched the place Harold always claimed to have grown up. There was also mention of a foster arrangement. She realized Janice might not be Harold's biological sister at all. Perhaps she was part of the arrangement, or maybe she was complicit somehow. Unease churned in her gut as she dialed Janice's number. The phone rang a few times before Janice answered. Her voice was polite, if a bit reserved, as always. Evelyn tried to keep her tone neutral. Janice, I'm at the farmhouse. I found some old documents in a sealed-off room. They're in German, mention the Stasi, and there's a photo of a young boy named Eric. Do you know anything about this? A pause. Evelyn heard Janice's breath hitch. Finally, she spoke, voice trembling slightly. Harold insisted it remain private. I was just a child when all of it happened, 8 or 9 years old. Men in suits came. They told my parents if we asked too many questions, we'd be putting Harold in danger. I never fully understood. Over time, I blocked it out. My parents were told to treat Harold as if he was always part of the family. They gave him the name Harold. He adjusted quickly, or so it seemed. We rarely spoke about it again. Evelyn gripped the phone. So you knew he wasn't your biological brother? Yes, Janice whispered. But I came to love him as one. My parents were told to move here to New York from the Midwest under some new identity arrangement. Then, eventually, we ended up with this farmhouse as part of the deal. Harold asked me never to bring it up. It was terrifying, Evelyn, especially for a child. Evelyn closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. I wish he'd told me. I understand he was probably scared, but I deserve to know. Janice sighed, the sound thick with regret. He believed that if too many people knew, it would risk everything. He also struggled with nightmares. Sometimes he'd speak German in his sleep when we were teenagers. My parents would hush him up. They were scared, too. After the Berlin Wall fell, we thought maybe it was all over, but Harold still refused to talk about it. I think he worried some faction might still come after him, or that the truth would ruin the life he'd built. I'm sorry. Evelyn felt anger flare in her chest, not just at Janice but at the entire situation. Thank you for being honest with me now, she managed. I'm going to find out what really happened. I need to. Janice was quiet a moment, then murmured, Be careful, Evelyn. This touches bigger forces than we understand. With that ominous warning, Evelyn hung up, emotions swirling. Fury, sorrow, confusion. She stared at the hidden room's contents, feeling dwarfed by the decades of secrecy. Harold had once been a little boy named Eric Vogel, forcibly removed from East Germany, reprogrammed, and placed with Janice's family in the U.S. The question remained, had he been an active spy or just another victim? In the following days, she delved deeper. She contacted old acquaintances, rummaged through Harold's files at home, found next to nothing. He had meticulously sanitized any traces that might hint at his origins. No childhood photos before the age of about 12. No birth certificate beyond a delayed file in New Jersey. Every detail looked almost too neat. She realized how thoroughly the program must have covered his tracks. Yet, each new piece of information brought fresh heartache. She discovered hidden letters in a trunk in the farmhouse's attic, letters in Harold's adult handwriting, addressed to an unknown recipient, never mailed. The English lines jumped out at her. I dream in German, though I don't remember learning it. Who am I? Another said, I fear telling Evelyn. She deserves the truth, but I can't risk it. Will they find me if I speak? She had to sit down, tears blurring her vision as she read Harold's desperation. He had wanted to confide in her, but terror stifled him. It broke her heart. The more she learned, the more she felt a creeping sense of being watched. Perhaps it was paranoia, but she couldn't shake the feeling that rummaging through these secrets put her on someone's radar. A few times, she thought she saw a car idling near the farmhouse, headlights on in the dusk. Once, at the local grocery store, a man she didn't recognize seemed to follow her aisles. When she turned to confront him, he slipped away. She reminded herself that she might be imagining threats where none existed. Still, Janice's warning rang in her ears. Evelyn tried to proceed carefully, confiding only in Professor Engel. He used his university resources to track down any references to Erich Vogel in Stasi-related archives. After weeks of searching, he found a single entry in an East German intelligence ledger dated 1970. Erich Vogel, subject to Kinderkontakt grooming, recommended for U.S. infiltration, 1971. The file ended abruptly. Engel explained that many archives had been destroyed near the fall of the Berlin Wall. They might never find more official records. Still, there was one lead, a name repeated in the ledger. Marta Richter. The note identified her as primary handler. Engel suggested that if Marta was alive, she might hold the key. After countless phone calls and internet searches, Evelyn discovered that an elderly woman named Marta Richter was living in Hamburg, Germany. She debated whether traveling there was wise, but her determination burned. Harold had lived with these secrets. She wanted to understand them fully, not just for her own sake, but for Harold's memory. If he'd lived in fear, maybe she could lay that fear to rest. She flew to Germany alone, leaving behind notes for Elaine, their adult daughter, telling her she was on a short research trip related to Harold's family. She hadn't yet revealed the truth to Elaine. She didn't know how to approach the conversation. Elaine assumed her father was from New Jersey, a Navy veteran, no big drama. The idea of smashing that narrative with the story of a reprogrammed East German spy child felt too big. Evelyn promised herself she would explain everything when the time was right. Hamburg was cold and drizzly the day Evelyn arrived. She felt jet-lagged and anxious. She'd arranged a meeting with Marta through a cautious series of intermediaries. A genealogist who specialized in post-Cold War reunifications had managed to track down Marta's caretaker. The caretaker, suspicious at first, eventually relented when Evelyn provided scans of the documents referencing Marta. Now, bundled in a coat, Evelyn made her way to a modest apartment building in a quiet residential neighborhood. Her heart pounded as she climbed the stairs. An elderly woman opened the door, hunched over, eyes sharp behind thick glasses. She introduced herself as Marta Richter, her English heavily accented but comprehensible. She led Evelyn into a small living room. The walls were lined with books, many about politics, psychology, history. Evelyn's gaze swept over them, wondering how many of these texts had shaped Marta's involvement in the Kinderkontakt program. Marta gestured for Evelyn to sit. The caretaker hovered in the background, watching warily. Marta spoke first, voice raspy. You come seeking knowledge of Erich Vogel? Evelyn nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. Yes, my late husband, Harold, was Erich, I believe. I found evidence he was part of a Stasi operation as a child. I need to know what happened to him. Marta's expression softened. Ah, so he lived a full life, I hope. The boy was gentle, not like some children who took well to the training. He cried at night. He missed his real mother, though we told him she was gone. We needed him to forget. Evelyn leaned forward, tears threatening. What did you do to him? Marta sighed. I was part of a group assigned to identify children with potential. Eric was bright, bilingual even at a young age. We planned to turn him into a covert asset. It was the Cold War. Our leaders believed anything was justified. We used psychological conditioning, carefully rewriting his memories. We taught him English, gave him new habits, arranged a new family in America that was sympathetic or at least obedient. But Eric fought the programming. He refused to forget everything. Eventually, we decided he was too emotional, not reliable. Still, he was placed. We lost track of him. Evelyn's voice trembled. You stole his life. Marta nodded, unrepentant but subdued. Yes, it was the nature of that time. We believed it was for a greater cause. Now I see the cruelty. I hold regrets, but it is too late for me to make amends. Hot tears escaped Evelyn's eyes. He never told me. He lived in fear. Did you keep tabs on him afterwards? I was asked to leave the program before the wall fell. Many records were burned. I never saw him again, Marta said. But I remember him. I recall the sadness in his eyes. He was never meant to be a spy. He yearned for a normal family. Those words gutted Evelyn. She pictured Harold reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, that distant look in his gaze. He yearned for a normal family, yet never let her see his deeper vulnerability. He did have a normal life in a way, she said softly. He married me, we had a daughter, but he carried secrets and never shared them. Marta patted Evelyn's hand, her voice surprisingly gentle. He survived, and he found love. Yes, that is more than many in Kinderkontakt managed. Many ended badly, used for infiltration and tossed away. Evelyn took a shaky breath, feeling a cocktail of rage and sorrow. I want to ensure that no one tries to dig up his past now that he's gone. His secrets should rest with him. But I also want my daughter to know the truth of who her father was, so she can have closure. Marta nodded. You have that choice. The agencies that once oversaw him are long dissolved. If your only goal is closure, I suspect no one will stand in your way. They spoke for an hour more, with Marta filling in details. She described the farmhouse in upstate New York as a covert outpost used by certain East German contacts traveling under false identities. After the program collapsed, the outpost was abandoned, leaving behind that hidden office in the basement. Marta apologized in her own reserved way, but it did little to ease Evelyn's heartbreak. When Evelyn emerged from the apartment building, she felt emotionally drained, yet strangely lighter, as if she finally understood Harold's entire life. The journey back to the airport felt unreal. She carried pages of notes she had scribbled while Marta talked, an expanded mosaic of Harold's stolen childhood. She realized, in the hush of that airplane cabin, that Harold's distance and reticence were not personal rejections, but survival tactics. He had never been free to share. Even in his final days, perhaps some fear lingered that revealing his past might endanger her or Elaine. Upon returning to the United States, she returned to the farmhouse, standing again before the hidden room. The old equipment was still there, the silent reel-to-reel recorder, the dusty maps. She considered destroying it all, wiping away any trace of the Stasi's intrusion. But she decided to preserve it for now. She took thorough photos, wrote her own reflections, determined to craft a coherent story to share with her daughter. Something that honored Harold's legacy without sensationalizing the pain he'd endured. The time came when she could no longer keep Elaine in the dark. Elaine was in her late 30s, married with a baby on the way. Harold's death had already shaken her, and Evelyn hated the idea of compounding her grief with these revelations. Yet it felt more important than ever to ensure Elaine understood the father she thought she knew. She invited Elaine to the farmhouse on a crisp autumn weekend. They shared tea in the cluttered old kitchen, the wind rattling the windows. Evelyn took Elaine's hands and said, I have something to tell you about your dad. He was a wonderful man, but he had secrets he never spoke about. With trembling words, Evelyn recounted the story. The Kinderkontakt program, Harold's real name, Eric, the coerced relocation. She watched Elaine's face cycle from shock to disbelief to heartbreak. Elaine sank into a chair, tears brimming. How could this be real? Elaine managed. He never said anything. Evelyn exhaled slowly. He was terrified, I think. He wanted to protect us, or perhaps he simply couldn't face it. But it doesn't change who he was to us. He loved us in the only way he knew. Elaine wept, shoulders shaking. Evelyn wrapped her arms around her daughter, tears slipping from her own eyes. They sat like that for a long time, mother and daughter, grieving anew for Harold's tormented past. Gradually, Elaine asked to see the hidden room. Together, they went downstairs. Elaine stood in stunned silence, gazing at the old spy equipment, the child's desk. She picked up the photograph labeled Eric. She traced the faded edges with her fingertips. He looks so sad, she whispered. Evelyn rubbed her back. He was, but he found you, and me. That was his salvation, I believe. Elaine nodded, tears still clinging to her lashes. We have to keep this secret, right? Or do we expose it? Evelyn thought of the subtle threats, the sense of being watched. She thought of Harold's letters, his fear. Finally, she shook her head. I want no wide exposure. It serves no one now. If there are people who might still exploit this, I won't let them. But we can share it with close family so he's understood. We can keep his legacy ours. Elaine agreed. They spent hours reading Harold's unsent letters, listening to a single old tape they found in the reel-to-reel. The tape mostly contained German lessons, a stern male voice drilling the boy in vocabulary. But at one point, they heard the boy, Harold's voice, tentatively say, I want my mother, in German. The recording ended abruptly. Elaine's tears returned, and Evelyn squeezed her hand. A few weeks later, Evelyn made the decision to hold a small memorial at the farmhouse. She invited only a handful of trusted relatives, including Janice. In the living room, she displayed photos of Harold from throughout his life. The earliest known pictures from his teenage years, their wedding portrait, snapshots of him with Elaine as a toddler. She also set out the photograph of him as Eric, though she did not display the German espionage documents. She explained, gently and succinctly, that Harold had once been part of a covert program that robbed him of his birth identity. She asked that those present respect the privacy of that information. Janice wept openly, admitting she felt guilt for decades, having never spoken up, never tried to free Harold from the deception. Evelyn placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You were a child yourself. None of this was your fault. They lit candles in Harold's memory. Elaine read a letter she'd written to her father, thanking him for providing a loving home, apologizing that he had to carry so much alone, promising to honor his memory without shame. They cried together, an intimate circle of grief and understanding. Life settled into a new normal. Evelyn sold her suburban house and put effort into renovating the farmhouse. Over time, she found a strange solace there, feeling closer to Harold amidst its hidden corners. She preserved the secret room as a kind of museum to Harold's early life, though she sealed it more discreetly. She knew few would ever see it, but she felt it was essential to keep the truth alive for the family's sake. Professor Engel called occasionally with updates on any new historical tidbits he uncovered about Kinderkontakt. The program remained a dark footnote in Cold War history. He recommended that Evelyn write a personal account, even if she never published it, to document Harold's story. She began journaling extensively, weaving Harold's letters with her own reflections. The process felt therapeutic, a way to connect with her husband now that he was gone. Eventually, Elaine gave birth to a son, a healthy baby boy. She named him James Eric, giving him Harold's birth name as a middle name, reclaiming it from the shadows. Evelyn felt tears of both sadness and joy when she learned of the name. It was a gentle tribute, a way to remind themselves that the child Harold had once been was not entirely lost. The cycle of life continued, carrying forward the good that Harold had created despite his painful origins. As the years passed, Evelyn found herself increasingly at peace. When she thought of Harold, she no longer felt confusion or anger, only love and compassion. She understood his silence was never a betrayal. It was an act of survival. In a way, he had been protecting her and Elaine from a labyrinth of danger. Perhaps he had also been protecting his own fragile psyche, too traumatized by the forced break with his past. She forgave him for not sharing the truth. She hoped that, wherever he was now, he felt that forgiveness. Sometimes, she would take a lawn chair out into the overgrown field behind the farmhouse and watch the setting sun. She remembered Harold's quiet presence by her side, how he would hold her hand without speaking. She realized he had shown his love through steadiness, through gentle acts of care, even if his words had been few. Knowing the root of his emotional reserve made her cherish every small kindness he had offered. On the anniversary of Harold's passing, she gathered with Elaine and Janice again. They stood by a simple memorial stone under a large oak tree on the property. Elaine held baby James Eric in her arms. Janice placed a bouquet of wildflowers. Evelyn said a few words about Harold, acknowledging that she saw his life as an example of resilience. He had been uprooted, reprogrammed, and yet he chose to build a life defined by love rather than espionage. He had, in his own way, escaped the Stasi's grip. The next day, Evelyn prepared a short letter to the caretaker of the Stasi archives in Germany. She decided to quietly request that any file on Erich Vogel remain sealed or destroyed if it was found. She explained that the man in question had passed away, leaving behind a family who desired no involvement in old Cold War vendettas. She didn't know if they would oblige, but the gesture felt like a final act of protection for Harold. She never received a response, and she chose to interpret that silence as a tacit acceptance. She remained vigilant for any sign that old ghosts from Harold's past might surface, but none did. The world had moved on, burying the Stasi's clandestine horrors in historical footnotes. Harold's life story was just one among many tragedies of that era. Evelyn's priority was not to expose it to the public, but to preserve it carefully for those who truly mattered. A year later, she found herself rummaging through the farmhouse's closets, determined to do a thorough cleaning. She stumbled upon an old suitcase stuffed in a corner. Inside was a single cassette tape, labeled in Harold's neat handwriting, "To E. If anything happens." Her heart lurched. She rushed to find a cassette player. The tape crackled to life, and Harold's voice emerged, a little shaky. He spoke in English, but the accent was slightly different than she remembered, as if his repressed German intonations surfaced under stress. "Evelyn," he began, voice taut with emotion. "I don't know if you'll ever hear this. I might lose the nerve to give it to you. There are things I can't say, but I wish I could. I was born Erich Vogel. Everything else was given to me. My name, my memories, all shaped by the Stasi. I wanted to keep you safe, but also, maybe I was a coward. I love you. I love Elaine. Please forgive me for what I can't tell you." He paused. She heard him take a ragged breath. "If you find out the truth, just know that my life with you was real, more real than anything they forced upon me. I was never a spy. I never harmed our country. I tried to break free. You gave me that freedom. I'm sorry for the lies. Please, remember me kindly." The tape ended abruptly. Evelyn clutched it to her chest, tears falling freely. She played it twice more, memorizing every nuance of his voice. It felt like a final gift from beyond the grave. He had left her reassurance, an explanation, and a plea for understanding. In that moment, any lingering anger dissolved. All she felt was profound love for the man who had fought so hard to live an honest life in the face of a monstrous system. She called Elaine, asking her to come over. Together, they listened to Harold's tape, tears streaming, baby James fussing gently in the background. Elaine whispered that she wished her father could have spoken those words in person, but she was grateful to at least hear them now. They decided to store the tape in a locked box in the hidden room, a symbolic unity of Harold's real past and the life he built in America. In time, the farmhouse became a place of healing. Evelyn turned the upstairs bedrooms into cozy spaces for when Elaine and her family visited. She planted a garden out back, turning the once overgrown field into a riot of color each spring. She often found herself humming quietly, a habit Harold once teased her for. She felt his presence in every nook of the house, especially in that hidden basement office, which she occasionally visited to remind herself of how far he had come from that frightened boy, Eric Vogel. Though the memories of Harold's secrecy had once brought her anger and pain, they now evoked compassion. She saw his entire journey as an act of survival. He had been stolen from his homeland, molded into someone else, yet he chose love over all else. Perhaps he never fully healed from the trauma, but he gave her and Elaine a stable, caring family life. That was his triumph. The burdens he had shouldered, he did so to spare them the same fear. The day baby James spoke his first words, Elaine called Evelyn excitedly. She swore it sounded like he was trying to say, Eric, though it was likely just baby babble. Evelyn smiled tearfully, remembering the battered photograph of that solemn boy. She liked to imagine that somewhere, Harold's spirit watched over them with quiet pride. The cycles of secrecy and fear ended with him, replaced now by truth, empathy, and love passed down to the next generation. Occasionally, Evelyn still received calls from journalists or curious acquaintances who had heard rumors about hidden spy relics in the farmhouse. She politely declined to comment, spinning a tale that the property had old radio equipment from a previous owner's hobby. No one pressed too hard. The Cold War had long since ended, and sensational headlines about a single child operative held little currency in the modern news cycle. Her vow to protect Harold's secret remained firm. As the seasons turned, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of purpose. She began volunteering at local historical societies, sharing broad insights about post-war adoptions and displaced children, never once naming Harold specifically. She believed that shining a light on such tragedies could spark compassion for others who had lost their families due to conflicts. She met people from Eastern Europe who had also endured fractured identities, forging a new empathy with them. She discovered that Harold's story was not an isolated anomaly but part of a larger tapestry of Cold War injustices. In her quieter moments, she wrote. She penned pages upon pages, detailing how she discovered Harold's real identity, how she came to terms with it, how she forgave him. She documented Marta's revelations, the letters, the tape, everything. She titled it Eric's Legacy, uncertain if it would ever be published but wanting it preserved in case Elaine or James, or any future descendants hungered for the full truth. She wrote with a balanced tone, neither glorifying nor damning. She wanted them to see Harold as he was, a kind man shaped by extraordinary adversity. By the time Elaine's second child was born, a girl named Anna, Evelyn felt her family was whole again. She watched Elaine's children run through the farmhouse halls, giggling, peeking into rooms they were told were off-limits. Evelyn didn't mind. One day, when they were older, she would show them the hidden office, maybe let them see the worn maps of Berlin and Dresden, explaining how their grandfather once belonged to those distant places. She took comfort in the knowledge that Harold's life, though shadowed by a Cold War he never asked for, ended in warmth and acceptance. Whatever chaos he had endured as Eric Vogel, he found refuge as Harold Morrison, married to Evelyn, father to Elaine. That was the truth she clung to. He had loved them, and no labyrinth of espionage or reprogramming could erase that. Years melted together, and eventually Evelyn grew old. She filled her days with family gatherings, birthdays, holidays under the farmhouse roof. She laughed at the memory of how startled she had been to discover the sealed door in the basement. That door had once symbolized secrets and betrayal, but now she viewed it as the threshold to understanding the man who shared her life for 4 decades. She had no regrets about prying it open. She often pictured Harold's face the last time she saw him conscious in the hospital. He had locked eyes with her, as though summoning the courage to say something. Perhaps he had wanted to unburden himself, to let her into the darkest corners of his past. He never found the words, but now she knew them anyway, and she cherished him more for his flawed bravery. As she moved through her twilight years, she kept Harold's memory alive in small gestures. She taught James and Anna a few basic German phrases, like, Guten Tag, and Danke, telling them it was part of their heritage in a roundabout way. When she visited Harold's grave, she sometimes whispered, "I know who you really were. I love you still." She believed, in her heart, that he heard. In final reflection, she concluded that Harold's silence was not a lie but a shield he used to protect himself, and those he loved, from a world that once demanded his compliance. The Stasi might have shaped his childhood, but he chose his adult life with Evelyn. That truth outshone the darkness of his origins. And if the Cold War had stolen Eric Vogel's name, Evelyn had reclaimed it by passing it on to her grandson with pride and tenderness. Time wove onward, but Harold's secret no longer haunted her. She felt it as a quiet hum beneath the surface of her days, a reminder that love transcends even the harshest manipulations of the past. People are more than their origins, she realized. Harold was living proof that a stolen identity need not destroy one's capacity for genuine connection. In the end, Evelyn carried Harold's story with reverence. It taught her compassion, resilience, and the profound courage it took for him to forge a new life after losing everything. It taught her that sometimes, the deepest bonds are forged in secrets never spoken, but endured. She closed the hidden door for the last time, leaving behind the old maps and letters, certain that Harold's legacy was safe in her heart, and in the hearts of the family he left behind. She had discovered the truth, forgiven his silence, and woven his past into their present with gratitude. She was at peace. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.